Hi Anna, thanks for meeting me.
Hi Adriana, thanks for having me.
So I'm just gonna ask you some questions about living in Caracas and the way you consume news and how the lack of news coverage can affect the public opinion people have on Venezuela. So my first question would be, how do you feel about the fact that social media is the only news outlet and news coverage your country has?
Well, it's definitely something interesting to consider, as a significant amount of Gen Z uses social media as their primary source of news. And I would say that the vast majority of news I daily consume come from social media platforms. However, I personally believe that having social media as the only news outlet in Venezuela can actually be considered beneficial, as we live in authoritarianism. So the government can silence other news platforms or can simply handpick whatever news coverage they want on TV, as they have done for many years, but they can only control social media to some extent.
Since you said that a significant amount of Gen Z uses social media as their primary source of news, my next question is, do you think social media has a bigger impact than in a country that has freedom of press, like in the US, for example?
I would say so. The government controls the content and those who display content on TV. So the only way to have access to news is social media. However, the fact that social media is the only news outlet in Venezuela does not imply that we have freedom of press within these platforms, as the government has threatened many journalists and reporters to the extent where the only option for them was to flee the country.
So do you think social media is a weak source of documentation, especially considering that we're talking about a country where one tragic event happens after another?
Yes, the lack of news coverage is worse than even Venezuelans can imagine. It is even hard for Caraqueños to know what's happening outside Caracas. As you said, I live in a country where one tragic event happens after another, and without proper means of news coverage, some can go unnoticed. This should never happen, and yet it constantly does. It has made many human rights violations go without documentation. Entire states have gone without electricity for weeks, and all this happening without the knowledge of other Venezuelans, let alone the world. It is interesting to compare this to Texas winter storm and the coverage that it got, as it should. Sadly, these events in Venezuela are many times left uncovered.
It's interesting to think that the alarming news of what happened in Texas brought so much awareness and attention to it that people got together to raise money to aid Texans that suffered consequences from the storm.
You're right.
Does this make you feel a sense of helplessness, knowing that the press is entirely controlled by the government?
What makes me feel more helpless is knowing that I am privileged just because I have access to internet. A significant amount of Venezuelans do not have access to internet. This means that they do not have access to social media and consequently don't know what's happening outside their households. And maybe even worse, they cannot document what's happening within their households. This constitutes a bigger problem in our society. Often, the worst kind of human rights violation happen in these areas that are too poor to have a Wi-Fi connection or even access to smartphones. Yeah, it's interesting to know that even in this era of technology, a lot of people are falling behind just because of poverty.
It's also interesting to think about the importance that media has over a country and how important it is to show the realities, even if they're not pretty, just to raise awareness and help people that are going through this. But those are all my questions for today. Thank you for giving me your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Adriana.